So yes, well, welcome to You Are the Hero, a conversation with Sir Ian Livingstone, hosted by Megaphone Writers CIC in collaboration with Unbound Publishers. For those of you who don't know us, Megaphone Writers CIC is a small grassroots organisation supporting people of colour who write children's and YA literature. You can find out more about us at www.megaphonewrite.com. This is a really special one-off event for us, and we're very excited to be hosting the author of books that so many of us remember as formative childhood reading. We know that there'll be lots and lots to learn here. Our interviewer tonight is one of Megaphone's former mentees, Iqbal Hussain, whose debut novel Northern Boy is out now with Unbound. Iqbal has lots of great questions prepared, but at the end there will be time for us to pose your questions. We have selected some from the Eventbrite registration form, but if you think of any this evening, please click on the Q&A button and you can add them there. I'm not sure if we'll have time for all of them, but we will try to get through a few. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Iqbal and Sir Ian.
Stephanie, thank you so much. So Ian co-founded Games Workshop in 1975 with Steve Jackson, launching Dungeons & Dragons in Europe and later Warhammer, White Dwarf and Citadel Miniatures. In 1982, he co-wrote The Warlock of Firetop Mountain with Steve Jackson, the first title in the multi-million selling fighting fantasy game book series. He's a former executive chairman of video games publisher Eidos, where he launched blockbuster titles Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, and Hitman. He's currently general partner at Hero Capital. He lives in London, where he has a collection of over 1,000 board games and a life-size statue of Lara Croft, which you can see in the background. Ian, welcome.
Hello there.
Thank you. It's so lovely to have this opportunity to speak to you. I met you at the book launch, and just I want to quickly, for anyone who's not seen these yet, this is the beautiful, beautiful, beautiful new book in the Fighting Fantasy series, The Dungeon on Blood Island. And this is stunning and really heavy because it's got so much content. Magic Realms from Unbound Publishing, and that's a collection of artwork from the Fighting Fantasy books and other books. So just going to put those away. Stunning. Ian, so you're back with two new books, as I said. Both books for me have stirred incredible memories of both old and new. It took me back playing that book. I was 10 years old again. I was rolling dice. I was keeping scores on the little sheets on the back. It's wonderful to have these books out there. What made you write them?
Well, originally or recently?
Recently first.
Well, they survived the test of time. As you say, The Warlock of Firetop Mountain came out in 1982, and the fans have stayed with the genre. And the difficulty about writing this particular book was, am I writing it for 10-year-olds of today or 45-year-olds masquerading as 10-year-olds? So I try and appeal to both markets. So hopefully there's plenty of excitement for new readers and lots of memory and nostalgia and new challenges for existing readers. But the reason I do it is because, you know, Fighting Fantasy has always been a passion project and had a huge following in the 1980s in particular. And the fans are all over the world. They were translated into over 25 languages. And it's just great to be still part of that world, you know, the world we've created, Steve and I, and for other people to enjoy it is very, you know, humbling, and we love to keep going. So every time I finish a new book, I always think, well, that's definitely going to be the last one. I'm nearly 75 years old, and about 2 weeks later, much to the chagrin of my wife, who hears it, groans when I say I've got an idea for another book, the whole process begins again.
Ian, coming back to that, how did you come to write that original book, The Warlock of Firetop Mountain, which is the first book in the Fighting Fantasy series? How did the idea come? How did the inspiration come? And had there been other books at the time that had that structure, that very interactive structure? Or did you and Steve, between you, hone something and make it something completely new?
Well, around the same time in the United States, although we hadn't seen them, was a series of books that became known as Choose Your Own Adventure. And that was simply a branching narrative book where it's effectively choose your own paragraph. And what we did was the first people to create a branching narrative, but attaching a game system to it, so you could play and read your way through the book. How it came about was we used to run these events called Games Day. We co-founded Games Workshop in 1975, launched Dungeons and Dragons, became huge, obsessive Dungeons and Dragons players. And without Dungeons and Dragons and Gary Gygax's Games Workshop would have never got to the stage it is today, because that was the success of the early days. So we used to run these conventions called Games Day, and we had thousands of people attending, playing Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games. And a commissioning editor from Penguin Books was in attendance of Games Day 1979, and she was fascinated by how enthralled and passionate people were playing D&D. And she said to Steve and I, would we consider writing a book about the hobby of role-playing? And we replied that, well, rather than writing a book about the hobby, why don't we write a book that allows you to experience role-playing without having the slightest idea about what that would entail? So she said, great, send in a synopsis. So we then thought, wow, what are we going to do now? So we thought, how can we strip the essence of a role-playing game where you take on the role of heroes and wizards and explore these dungeons created by the dungeon master, going these fantastic journeys of the mind, killing monsters, finding treasure, and leveling up. Participation in a fantasy world is what role-playing allows you to do, effectively theatre on the fly. So we thought, well, we can replace the dungeon master with multiple choice in book format. The book, although it is kind of multiple choice, you can't say anything, of course, to the book other than the choice presented to you. And attach this game system. So have a very cut down role-playing systems for 3 attributes: skill, stamina, and luck. And so we wrote this concept, which we contained, called the Magic Quest. And we sent it in to Geraldine, and she thought this was marvelous. So she went off to tell the managing director of Penguin Books all about this branching narrative book. Interactive books haven't been done before. Isn't this great? And apparently he and the senior management laughed so hard they banged their head on the table and said, there's no chance that interactive books could ever replace linear books. Go away. But she was fantastic, and she fought our corner. And it took her nearly a year. She finally gave up on Penguin and went to the Puffin imprint from the same company and convinced the senior commissioning editor at Puffin Books to say yes. So we then set about writing it. It turned into 400 paragraphs and a book in which you are the hero. You give choice to the readers, and through choice and consequence, you navigate your way through this book, hopefully to come out victorious. Obviously, my job is to make sure you fail and end your adventures in rather terrible ways of falling down pits onto poisonous spikes or getting toasted by a fire-breathing dragon. So she said, great. We wrote it, and it finally came out in 1982. Without much awareness, the Penguin reps didn't know what an interactive book was, but it was the virality of the day was not, of course, mobile phones, or of course there weren't any, and there was no internet, but it was the power of the word of mouth, power of the chat on the playground created the buzz that led to it becoming, eventually international bestsellers.
Oh, absolutely. I remember at school, literally, it used to go around the playground, and each time a new title came out, everyone was literally, oh, have you got book 2? Have you got book 3? Have you got? It was definitely word of mouth. Boys in particular loved playing it, but I had girlfriends who also played. Can I just ask you, when you first came up with the idea and you pitched it, and then you submitted it, did it almost take longer to come up with the format? Because it's quite a complex format, I think. As an author who writes normal books that are linear, that's hard enough. But here you've got the story, but you've got the gameplay, but then you've got all the little elements of how the dice work, how the luck, skill, stamina boxes work.
Yeah.
Did that take as long almost as writing it, or was it easier than what I'm thinking it was?
It was probably easier for us having played Dungeons and Dragons for 7 years, so we're familiar with game systems and role-playing systems and experience and fluctuating scores for your personal attributes as a player. So we were familiar with that.
Right.
So it was a question of distilling it down to a simplified gaming system. But nevertheless, they're an absolute nightmare to write because you're writing effectively several stories at once. So, and then you have to keep a record of every part that the story branches. So we used to do it and still do on a flow chart. So you annotate each number and where it splits to. So 1 goes to 27 and 117, for example. And there you write down what happens in those in kind of brief format. So you could say goblin, 2 gold pieces, and a magic flute, for example, you'd find in this particular one. But of course, you've got to try and be devious in the way you design it, so people miss the crucial information or miss the magic item which they need eventually to succeed later on. So you're kind of doing a lot of back and two in the writing of them, because you later on in the adventure you have created a room with a door which is locked, therefore you need a key to get in. You don't have the key at this point, so you have to go back to early in the adventure and place the key in a difficult to find place where the reader may or may not find it. So it will task you with having that key or not. So there are literally hundreds of ways of going through the book, but only usually one way of succeeding. But of course, kids in particular cheated all the time. I used to see people on public transport with what I call the 5-fingered bookmark as they effectively peeking around the corner. And I'm sure you never cheated, did you, Iqbal?
No, I have to confess, I started off doing them honestly, and then each time I got killed, I thought, no, I'm not having it. And then the 5-finger bookmark absolutely happened.
Yeah, people said, with they're not happy with the dice roll they had. Oh well, but that was a practice roll. I'll re-roll and stuff.
Yeah, yes.
Fine. The thing is about Fighting Fantasy game books is that it really places you there, so the imagination is absolutely stimulated, and of course, the extra stimulation you get as a child from the art that we had in those. We commissioned all our Games Workshop artists because we wanted art that really excited young imaginations. And Penguin Books, under the Puffin brand, being a children's imprint, were worried about the art that we were proposing because they wanted a nice, safe art because it was children's prints, because it was being bought by 9, 10, and 11-year-olds. So they wanted, like little toadstool, a little goblin, and butterflies buzzing around its head and a kind of sleepy frog in the background. Whereas we wanted hideous monsters down a dungeon that are about to rip your face off. But to their credit, they allowed us to do that, to commission our artists. And we work with some of the best artists in the world. I mean, of course, that's what Magic Realms is features about, all the art and the artists that were so crucial in establishing the canon, the genre, the look and feel. Yeah. And they don't always get the credit they deserve, artists, but we work with some of the best. I mean, for example, the guy who did 4 of my book covers, including City of Thieves, he went on to create Darth Maul for George Lucas. So but then we gave them some of their early breaks, and they went off to have some really incredible gigs over the years.
I mean, the artwork is absolutely, it was pivotal to the look of the books, the feel of the books, the success of the books, and just going through Magic Realms has been, it has taken me right back, and I forgot just the range of art. It wasn't all the same, so different books had different feels. Did talking about the issue of like censoring and stuff, I've got some modern versions of the Warlock of Firetop Mountain, so I've got these 2 reprinted versions, which are not the original versions. Their art is quite different, I realize. One of it seems to be like computer generated, so it's got a soft focused look, and the other one's got something that's a bit more akin to the original version. Yeah. Do you find that in the modern versions the artists have had to tone stuff down? Do you have any say in that? Do like modern sensibilities come into things that would have been perfectly fine in the 80s might not be all right now?
You just opened a wonderful can of worms right there. So with Puffin, as I said, we managed to convince them for us to be able to use our artists, and the children loved it.
Mm.
They can they knew the difference between fantasy and reality, so they were excited by the visual fidelity and the accuracy and the fine detail of the illustrations that were in our Fighting Fantasy game books. And you're showing two of the later publications, so originally published by Puffin, then the one that was in your left hand was published by Icon Books under their Wizard brand,
Right.
which had a new cover. The one in your left, oh, that's your right hand, isn't it? I suppose I'm looking
Yes.
at the one that's not the yellow.
That one. Yes.
That was published by Wizard Books, and they used the same illustrations inside, but they had a new
Yes.
cover book.
That's right.
Still fit in with the canon and aesthetic of the early Fighting Fantasy game books.
Yes.
More recently, Scholastic became publishers, and whilst I thought we were going to, yes, whilst I thought we were supposed to be in control of the art, for the first 10 books we weren't, and I think it was down to economy and speed that they commissioned an artist who did it digitally, but the remit he had was apparently to appeal to a younger audience, try and get 8 and 9-year-olds into it. They felt like an anime, Photoshop, digital grayscale would be more in keeping. But my point is that you kind of lost the whole canon in so doing. So the characters in some of the early books of the new editions kind of lost what people have been looking at for so many years. But the story ends happily in that I've now convinced Scholastic to allow me to commission all the artists. So the new book, the Dungeon on Blood Island, has an amazing cover from Ian McKay, the
Stunning.
earlier, and the internal art is done by a fantastic artist called Christian Balla from Hungary. Albeit they are digital, the internal ones, but nevertheless they've kept the detail and the fidelity of the early pen and inks that were so gracefully put in the editions.
That one feels more like the original ones felt, and it's just been given this slightly slick look inside of the pictures, but the detail is there. All the horrible stuff is there, so it's exactly what I would have wanted.
Horrible in a nice way, I hope.
yeah, absolutely. I noticed that these versions have got a little dice at the bottom. Was that always a feature?
It wasn't in the old days, because most people used to carry dice around with them, because in the analog world, dice was just another physical thing that people had. So for those who don't have dice, the idea for the combat is that you just open the book on a random page and that's your dice roll.
It's a really clever thing, actually. Can I just go back to the writing process, because it's I tried it as a child and a teenager and got myself into a real pickle very quickly. And even though I think I was being clever by doing little flow charts and little trees and things, how do you stop yourself going off into these massive trees that keep branching and branching? How do you keep it? How do you go back to where you have come from? How do you control those options? I found that fascinating.
You want me to give my trade secrets away now? I'd much rather see you branching out into infinity and never coming back again.
Are you still doing it on paper?
I am still doing it on paper, yeah. The only thing that changed since the 1980s, 1882, was I've replaced my fountain pen with a word processor. So I use Word doc now as opposed to a pen and ink. But the process itself has not changed. So I still create a flow chart and physically annotate the flow chart with what you can discover. And I still do the same pre-allocation of 400 numbers, cross them up as I go. And yeah, I'm stuck with one way. So I don't use, there is software you can use like Twine that does branching for you, but I've never used it and will never use it. Not that I'm into technology. I've lived most of my career in technology with video games. It's just that I'm kind of stuck in a rut, and it'd be impossible for me to change.
But if it works, stick with it. That number of 400, so most of the books have got 400 sections.
Yeah.
With the first book, was the 400 an accidental thing? It just happened to be 400, or had you got 400 in your head? And some of the books don't have 400.
Yeah.
I think 2 or 3 of them have slightly less.
I know.
What happened with those?
Well, they're in the errata column. They should have been 400, but weren't. And the first one had just by chance 399. So there's a bogus reference in there, which make it up to 400 because we thought that was nice and tidy to have 400.
That's lovely. And with the fighting fantasy books, were you ever, did the words always come first, or did sometimes some of the pictures come first, or you had an artist in mind and that influenced how that particular story worked out?
The words always come first. It's written before it's illustrated. Then I have certain artists who I adore and want to work with. For example, Ian McCaig and Carl Kopinski, to name 2, because we're on the same wavelength, and you don't have to labor the point too much of what you're expecting in an image. And both of those, particularly Carl and Ian, they are able to create a sense of movement and an adventure, as though you not only feel that you're there, but you feel that you're in a moment that something awful or terrible is about to happen, or something dynamic is about to happen. So you have that sense of drama and movement and jeopardy just captured in an illustration. And the detail they have is so, even though it's pen and ink illustration, it seems so real. And that's, I think, the hallmark of a great artist.
Absolutely. What I find really interesting on reading your new book, but also in the books, the older books, is I always felt they were very pictorial. And I guess part of that is because it's written in second person, so you are instantly in the book. When you get the illustrations back, do they often surprise you because they're a bit different to how you'd pictured them? And do you input into them at that stage?
Yeah, they're usually better than I can imagine. And in particular, I mean, if I look, I still have all my original manuscripts because they were handwritten.
Wow.
And I look at some of the descriptions I sent off to Ian McCaig, and they're pretty bland, some of the descriptions, but his imagination, far greater than mine, he was able to capture that moment in a way I hadn't thought possible. So, for example, the Puffin edition of Forest of Doom, which do I happen to have here? No, I don't. But I do have City of Thieves. He just captures there's this metamorphosis of this little goblin-like creature sitting on a log, and it just suddenly spikes kind of poke out of its clothing, and it's kind of moving off the log and turning into this hideous beast, a shape changer. And you think it's actually happening in real time. And few people can do that. So many artists have kind of a static pose, and yet his is always dynamic.
No, absolutely. Again, just sticking with the writing process now, if that's all right. When you write the books, do you write the main branch first and then leave little markers of the little branching bits, or do you fill it in as you go along, so all the loopholes of all the choices are written, and then you go back to the main story?
Well, I have a overarching story arc, and the main protagonists, and will have designed some of the monsters, hopefully most of them being new. But it's an iterative process. So as I go, it changes dynamically. And I suddenly get an idea, based on what I've already written, and think, oh, I could really do with X here, or I could really do with Y here, and then off it goes. But the important thing is that choice has to have consequence. There's no point in door A and B having the same outcome. Because that's how you get the drama and the intensity of decision-making process for the reader. And then getting back to the point I never answered for you, I do bring stories back to pinch points, and you can steer them by creating cul-de-sacs or secret doors that bring you back always to a place where you give them critical information that they have to have.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it kind of sometimes literally lose the plot. They miss the plot. So it's that's why it's so important to have your flowchart absolutely totally accurate. And then, of course, having written it, then you have to balance the economy, balance the difficulty, make sure there are no loops that you can't get out of, and make sure at the end of the day that it's a really enjoyable story, whether branching, no matter which branching choices you make, that has to have that tension, drama, and to create that suspense of, you are the hero, I'm participating, and I'm going to achieve, and I'm going to get through.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know anything about what happens at the editing process? If the editor reads it, how it's set out in the final book form, or do you think they read it as it's played out?
The editorial is really about grammar these days.
Right.
They assume I know what I'm doing now,
Yes.
and I have a couple of playtesters who will test it for errors and accuracy, transpose numbers, so you're not going to 49 when you should be going to 94.
Yes.
But other than that, I'm given free rein now. So it's, I don't know if that's because of costs, trying to save on costs, or just trusting me, but I'm given free rein.
Oh, that's brilliant. You know what I find amazing, given that I think there's at least 50 titles in the original series, I think there were, and there's
59.
59, that's right, 59. Sold more than 20 million copies, translated into more than 30 languages. And in those 59, many of which you've written or you've co-written with Steve, it's a sheer range of genres and ideas and settings. Where does all that come from?
Well, from imagination, I guess, and reading tons of science fiction and fantasy books in my youth, playing 7 years of Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, most of my books are based in the fantasy world of Valencia. The Wall of Firetop Mountain was placed there. Firetop Mountain clearly in the center of Valencia, and then Forest of Doom, City of Thieves, Death Trap Dungeon, Trial of Champions are all set in the same geography, and trying to connect up the people and places to create a world that people can explore with cohesion. So that's why there's references in some books to other characters, other places, etc.
I was rather excited to see that in the dungeon on Blood Island, you've got the Blood Beast again, who was a cover of the Death Trap Dungeon, I think.
Yeah, the original Death Trap Dungeon. I thought he deserved a cameo role. I mean, people loved the Blood Beast a lot, so I thought, I think it's time to have
absolutely
bring him back briefly and have another stab at him, literally.
Yes, no, that's very true. I was going to just quickly. Somebody had asked on the Eventbrite thing. Where's that question? No, I can't locate. Yes, somebody said, have you any tips for world building? Because all the books always felt real, even though they're not real worlds usually. They might be set in space, they might be underwater, might be a dungeon, might be a forest. But you paint it with such economy, but with such truth. It always feels real, and I can picture it very easily, even if there aren't any illustrations. So how do you do that so well? How do you get your images from here onto the page?
Well, they've got to be authentic. They've got to be believable, even though it's fantasy. So you've got to imagine this could happen, and you've got to have that sense of jeopardy and danger and excitement. And so you have to have the corresponding words to put of some horrendous beast into their minds as though it's actually happening. And so if you feel you are there, then it's going to be more believable, it's going to be more exciting, and the images in your head are going to be that much more vivid, I suspect. So it's just choosing the right nouns and verbs
Mm.
to do that. But it's all about stimulating imagination.
Yeah.
And yeah, I have a very vivid imagination that's trying to translate what I see in my head into words. I mean, it's not
Right.
easy writing, as I'm sure you're well aware. It's tough, but you just have to do it. Um, Otherwise, you could spend 5 months staring at a blank piece of paper.
Yeah. How long does it take you to write a typical fighting fantasy book from the first draft until the final edits are in? How long is that process?
It takes a lot longer now with my ancient brain than it did in the old days. I mean, the early days was frightening in a way. We were running Games Workshop during the day, from like 9 in the morning until 6 at night, going to our respective homes and writing fancy game books from some 8 o'clock till 2 in the morning, and did that for over 2 years. And it was both exciting and draining at the same time. That's to be able to do that 5 or 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. But there was so much buzz around fighting fantasy. We were being sent on world tours and author tours that you couldn't help but want to do more of it. And so it's just a question of just going with it and see what happened. But no regrets whatsoever. But those days it would take 3 months, and now it's the best part of a year. But I'm probably spending obviously a lot less time doing it
Yes.
as I did in the glory years of the 80s.
Absolutely. It's remarkable. I mean, fighting fantasy is a huge part of my childhood. If you can imagine a young boy growing up north, literally in the cobbled streets of the north, and then there I am transported to World of Monsters and Fiends and things. You kind of foretold the advent of video games as well. When they first came out, I think home computers had just come out. ZX81, Spectrum, Commodore were just there. How does it feel to know that you probably did more to get boys in particular reading than any other form of book? And what did the educational establishment at the time think of the books?
Well, we didn't set out with that objective. We set out to write interactive adventures with a role-playing system, but we knew how popular they were. But we didn't think about it in a kind of context of education. We were doing it in the context of entertainment. It just so happened that education became front and center with Fighting Fantasy, because when we first wrote them, there was a lot of criticism for them. The Evangelical Alliance published an 8-page warning guide saying, because you're interacting with ghouls and demons, you're kind of bound to get possessed by the devil. A worried housewife in deepest suburbia phoned a local radio station and said, having read one of my books, her son levitated. So, of course, everyone who was listening, all the kids were listening, thought, what, for £1.50 we can fly? We'll have some of that. Local vicar threatened to chain himself to the railings of Penguin Books until they were banned. The petition sent in by worried parents saying that they're worried they should be banned because their children are using their imaginations too much, because in articles written saying that.
Wow.
At the same time, teachers were beginning to see how great they were in terms of getting reluctant readers, and as you say, boys in particular, to read, because there were short paragraphs, that we were empowered through choice. You were making the decisions. This is all about you. It wasn't a character who you may not or may not relate to. This was your adventure. And ultimately, they in time said that Finding Fancy game books were great for reluctant readers, great for critical thinking, great for creative writing, great for inspiring art.
Yeah.
Gave people a safe space to enjoy and fail happily and start again. And the number of people I've met subsequently who've grown up, who've thanked me so much for giving them a purpose in their youth when times were quite dark for them. And
Absolutely.
that's one of the reasons that I continue to write them, because it gave people who are having quite a tough time a time to escape and enjoy, and they could be winners, successful, and heroes, defeating the villains. And so for that, they eventually became known as greats for education, and in statistics show that they improved literacy levels by some 17%. Hey, Dad, sarcophagus.
I mean, honestly, they really did help people like boys like me and girls as well, especially
Yeah.
if you lived in an environment where you had very little control and you had very little action on anything around you, and then you lose yourself in the book. Suddenly, you're right, you were the hero. So they are pivoted. They're so important, and it amazes me that there were calls for them to be banned and all that nonsense. It's just incredible to me.
But they did
all
have
that
a
help.
strong female, readership in time, and we
Yes,
went through huge effort to make sure you didn't assume that it was a male character.
yes.
So if you ever read them, you'll see, even from the ones in the 80s, that you could not assume that the reader was male. So sometimes it's quite difficult with the language of the time to do that, but we did it.
That's a good point. Yeah, no, that's true. And talking about the famous strap line on the cover, "You are the hero," who came up with that?
I can't actually remember whether it's Steve or me. I think I came up with Fighting Fancy as a brand name as it became known ultimately, but I honestly can't remember who came up with "You Are the Hero."
It's so memorable.
Might have even been Coffee Books for all I know, but I suspect
Do-
that probably Steve or I, or both of us together, one night down the pub.
Talking of Steve, who's such an important part of the early books, particularly, are you still in touch with him? And if so, how's he doing?
I see him probably once every 10 days. He only lives a couple of miles away.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, he's doing all right. His last book was Secrets of Salamonis, and yeah, we play games together still, board games. So you're sitting in a room for 1,500 board games. We still enjoy playing board games with two other people that we've been playing for decades with.
Well, that's really lovely. So you guys have grown up together, like we readers have grown up with you guys. That's lovely. Um, Later on, different writers wrote books in the series. So, for instance, I think Charlie Higson has written at least one.
Yeah.
Of the ones that you didn't write, so this is also a question that came on Eventbrite. Have you got a favorite book, and or a book that surprised you in how it went, or that you admired because it did something a bit differently?
Well, the reason why we got the guest authors and originally we just couldn't keep up with the demand in the 80s. We were able, I said we were able to write one every 3 months, but they reached a point where Penguin were asking for one every 2 months, so we couldn't do it. We brought in guest authors, some who we worked with at Games Workshop. Games Workshop was really the primordial soup for the Game Book Writers Association, effectively, and more in more modern times, in more recent times rather, we've had Rihanna Pratchett,
Yes, that's right.
Terry Pratchett, and as you say, Charlie Higson. But I have never ever read anybody else's game books because I didn't ever want to be accused of plagiarism. So I cannot actually answer your question.
It's
But
a
I do
while.
know some of the better ones were written by Stephen Han, because if you look at the fan sites, they'll tell you which ones are the great ones, and also Jonathan Green.
Yes.
But I've never ever read one because I wanted to keep my mind kind of unfettered by other people's ideas.
I think it's a good move. I was going to say to you, talking about things changing and everything else. So Megaphone is for writers of color, a children's book of writers of color. Fantasy traditionally has had a lack of writers of color. Do you think this is changing as far as you know? And also, are more women writers writing fantasy? I don't know how much of that kind of impinges into your world, if you come into contact with other
Well,
writers?
I hope it's changing. I mean, everybody in the world has an imagination, have the ability to think of great stories set in a fancy world and put them on paper in book format. So
Yeah,
there's absolutely no reason why anybody can't write not just a fighting fantasy game book or a linear fantasy book. It comes from the imagination. What I would note is that the a lot comes from myths and legends from Arthurian Britain and from Greek mythology and Roman mythology. So, and having read Lord of the Rings, I mean, anybody can experience these worlds. Therefore, anybody can write these worlds.
mm, yeah. Ian, just before we go into a Q&A session, I've just got a final question, which is partly, again, has come from Eventbrite. The question is, whilst fighting fantasy has taken many forms over the decades, from game books to graphic novels and comics, has a film ever been suggested? And if so, what book could be up for adaptation? And also on this theme, what next for fighting fantasy? Have we got more books to look forward to? What about an immersive theatre experience, a theme park, anything like on those grounds?
Let's have them all. That'd be great. So seriously, there's a screenplay that exists for Death Trap Dungeon.
Oh, brilliant.
It's not been taken up thus far. The problem we've always had is that there's been no central character. We don't have a James Bond or a Lara Croft or a main character because you, the reader, are the hero. So what we have is a world. So that's always been a question number one for the film and TV Guardians. But having said that, there is an option that has been signed recently for an adaptation of Fighting Fantasy for the silver screen, which is very exciting, but I'm not able to disclose that. But I hope there would be some theatre as well. And I sometimes do them live at UK Games Expo. We had 400 people in a room, and I was reading out the options to John Robertson. I don't know if you've ever seen his crazy show, where he kills off everybody in the audience just about asking them crazy questions. So that's good fun because I get the audience try and advise him the wrong way to go, and that is very theatrical, and we use the audience as dice rollers, statisticians, fodder. That's good fun.
Oh, brilliant. Are you allowed to say what you might be working on currently?
Um, I can't say this loudly because my wife might be hearing, but I've got some ideas written down for a new book. I know Scholastic would like another book to appear in the not too distant future, but trying to get one out every 2 years is hard enough. But they're talking about having one a year, so
Oh,
I'll try.
wow.
I'll try and do what I can. There's a line of miniatures come out
Brilliant.
recently from Blue Giant, and could maybe collaborate with John Robertson. His show is called The Dark Room, and maybe to do something down the theatrical route because that's great fun. The live theatre and effectively theatre on the fly because
Yes.
fun that can be had from free free freewheeling it as we go through the adventure is quite amusing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, somebody's asked on the chat, Ian, what is the future for fighting fantasy? Have we got more fighting fantasy fests? And have we got any new writers coming on board?
There will be another Fighting Fantasy Fest. The last Fighting Fantasy Fest 5 happened in September at the University of West London. That's where we launched the Dungeon and Blood Island and also Magic Realms. There'll be one next time will be in 2026, so it's every 2 years. The writers, will there be more writers? That really comes down to Scholastic's thirst for new titles. At the moment, they only want one a year at best.
Yeah.
more recently it's been one every 2 years, and I've been filling that gap. But I guess we just have to wait and see. If the demand is there, there will be more titles for sure.
Brilliant. And are you still in touch with the editor at Puffin, Geraldine, I think her name was?
Geraldine Cook, yes, she came to Fighting Fantasy Fest 5, and
Oh, brilliant.
I've got a great photo of her. We're both looking a bit wrinkly these days, and we first saw in 1979, but we have great respect for each other. She's fantastic.
That's fantastic. I love that. Would you ever write, or maybe you have written a straightforward novel that's not a fighting fantasy novel?
Well, I actually have written one, but I sent it to an editor for her comments, and I think, in the words of the teacher, must try harder. So the thing is, with me, I describe everything in a fighting fantasy game book, and writing a linear thing, you have to do show, don't tell. So you
Yes.
shouldn't. So it's completely alien to how I write fighting fantasy game books. So I need to re-edit my own book before I can present it to a publisher.
Yes. Talking of re-editing, are there any books that you have written that you would now do differently, or you would approach differently?
I mean, I'm sure I've written a couple of really awful ones, but and some of them have been too hard. They haven't been play tested enough, but some people are masochistic and love the ones that are almost impossible to get through, and without cheating as well. So Crypt of the Sorcerer, I think, was one of my hardest books, and Steve's Creature of Havoc was particularly difficult to get through. But there's something for everybody in fighting fantasy, so I don't think I'd want to rewrite any of mine particularly.
What's done is done. Are you involved with the spin-off merchandise, such as the action figures and games?
Well, there are 3 board games coming out.
Brilliant.
One from Martin Wallace, which is a solo card game. It looks really fantastic, from Wallace Games. There's a German company called Ulysses that's making a kind of dungeon crawler, and there's an advanced fighting fantasy coming out from Arion Games, which is more traditional, as you'd see in a normal game book. So that's very exciting, and so I work with them in terms of giving my comments on not just the gameplay but also the art, because I'm very even more paranoid about making sure that the canon, the aesthetic, is kept in its true sense. And the miniatures of, yes, I very much had a big hand in that. Said to the sculptor, you must make this figure look like this piece of art, and they've done that brilliantly. This Blue Giants, if you Google Blue Giant Fighting Fantasy, you'll see how amazing they are.
Fantastic. In the foreign editions, because it's Fighting Fantasy has been translated in at least 30 languages, do they keep the same illustrations, or do they do their own illustrations? Do they keep the same covers?
They do most cases. A, because they like them, and B, it's quite expensive to have them redone. So it's a lot better to get second rights on existing art rather than commissioning new art.
Yeah.
Having said that, some cultures, conflicts come into play, and they want to have covers that they say is best for their market, which is fine by me, as long as they don't stray too far from what we're trying to achieve with ours. Because I think the appeal of these is quite universal.
Mm.
I do A/B testing occasionally. I give talks to children and to adults, and put one cover up against another, and I think I know what people want, but I get validation when that's 99% of the audience agree with me, so that's good.
Brilliant. We have a question from Daniel, and it's literally about to ask you the same question. Would you consider collaborating or co-authoring with Steve Jackson on a fighting fantasy game book again?
We did it for the first one, and frankly, it's a nightmare writing half each. So it's difficult because A, we have different writing styles,
Mm.
and then with the Wall of Fire Top Mountain, I wrote all the adventure up to the river with 3 crossing points, and he wrote everything after you cross the river, including the maze that a lot of people are still stuck in some 42 years later. And realized that was quite a nightmare for Steve because he had to learn and read everything that I'd written in mine. So it made the story continuous and then also well balanced. So it was quite difficult job for him to have to digest everything that I'd written. And then the styles were different, so he re-edited it as well after we'd written the first one together. So it's quite difficult to do that.
That's
So
really interesting.
that's the reason why he wrote the second one instead of Chaos. I wrote the third one, Forest of Doom. But that was also for satisfying the demand because Puffin eventually, after 11 reprints of the first one, said we need some more, and that really made Geraldine's day because I got a well done from the managing director of Penguin Books for spotting an area in the market they had not seen.
Absolutely. On the books that you co-authored with Steve, is that how you'd write them? One of you would write the first half, one of you would write the second half?
Well, the ones that the co-author where it says Steve Jackson in Livingstone presents is that we did no more on those other than approve the synopsis and the story itself, but then the guest authors did all the heavy lifting in the writing.
Got you.
And then we'd be very much involved with the art though.
Yes. With the guest authored books, did they have like a house style that was given to them? So certain things that you had to do or not do?
Yeah. I mean, Charlie Higson being Charlie Higson went a bit off piece a couple of times, some of his characters, and introducing a comedic tone to them, which not everybody enjoyed, but we tried to keep people on the rails. Yeah.
Yeah. I've got to we've asked that, Steve. I'm just gonna say, oh, this is an interesting one that came in on Eventbrite. I've noticed that the tone of role playing and fantasy has changed with their rise in mainstream culture. While this visibility has its benefits, do you think it has weakened the depth of these genres? So has the greater accessibility and visibility of role playing and fantasy weakened the depth of the genre?
The what? Invisibility?
The has weakened the while this visibility has its benefits, has it weakened the depth of these genres?
The visibility, I mean, because it's a more mass market phenomenon.
It's more mass market and they're more fantasy films.
Well, I don't think so, because if you look at the rules book now on Dungeons and Dragons and also Warhammer, they're far more of a mighty tone than they used to be.
Mm.
And some people are much more stickler for the rules, particularly Warhammer. Whereas in the early days of us playing Dungeons and Dragons, it was very much free form theatre on the fly, and the rules were there if you wanted them for deciding success or failure of events, whether you opened the door or not, whether you defeated the dragon or not. To use the dice and the combat results tables, etc., to have the gameplay element as well as the theatrical element of the interactive story created by the players themselves. But I think it's with a much wider mass market audience now. It's played in multiple ways, and I just say whatever works for you is fine by me.
Absolutely. Ian, we just have one very final, very specific question at the end. Is they would like to know if you're attending Luca Comics. It's mentioned on the website, but you are not on the guest list.
I am in the throes of getting my act together to go to Luca. I love Luca, and I enjoyed very much my time last year, and I've been previously. And I did the hands in the cement thing for a plaque that they put on there, which was going to be used on a footpath one day. So I've got great fondness for what they do there. Is extraordinary. I mean, it's a beautiful medieval town in the heart of Italy, and the whole place is taken over by this walled city by books, comics, and games. So there's an awful lot to like about Luca, and I need to confirm my attendance. They've been on at me for some time now. It's just I haven't been able to get around to it. Mainly not being rude, but largely because of a conflict with another thing I was hoping to go to. But it's going to be either or. But I do hope to be able to get to Luca.
Fantastic. And just one very quick final question from me. I noticed the other day that the original versions of the Five Fantasy books online sell for a huge sum of money, particularly if you have a full set of them. Have you got a full set?
Of course I have. And it's a mint set
Oh
completely.
my goodness.
Never read. They don't all sell for lots of money. It's the later editions that sell when it was coming to an end of publishing.
Right.
Because the early edition sold in the tens of thousands, in the case of Death Trap Dungeons in the hundreds of thousands.
Mm,
At the end, they were just printed in very low numbers. Books number kind of 55 and to 59. They're
yes.
quite rare, especially if they're to be in mint condition. So some of those are selling for £200, £300, 400 even.
Yeah.
But that's just down to rarity than anything else.
Oh, brilliant. Ian, it's been an absolute pleasure. That's the end of our hour. This has been an absolute highlight of my writing career to get to chat to one of my childhood idols. But you must hear this all the time, but it mustn't ever stop.
I never tire of it, and it's a great honor, and I'm really always
Thank
humbled
you.
by the experience. So I hope your books are a huge success, and may your stamina never fail.
Ian, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.